You're listening to Feathers, a podcast of stories of women walking in faith. I hope these stories inspire you and encourage you to take flight in your own faith. I'm your host, Amy Bennett, and this is Season 6, Episode 11. Feathers is an outreach of Abiding Ministries. Find more encouragement at abidingministries.net. Well, hey friend, and welcome to Feathers this week. I cannot believe we are on the back end of Season 6. It's been a great season so far. And listen, guys, I want your input about something. One of the things I'm considering doing is celebrating our 100th episode live in the next few months. So this episode you're listening to is episode 92, and so we're 5 episodes away from the end of Season 6. And so in the first few episodes of Season 7, we're going to be hitting episode 100. So I'm thinking about celebrating in person. I'll do a dinner, a panel to talk about the last 100 episodes, and then even record a live episode with a new guest. And I'm hoping to have some previous Feathers guests there that live in the area to come hang out too. So if that piques your interest at all and you could get to my town near Charlotte, North Carolina, I'd love to hear from you. Email me at contact@abidingministries.net or message me on Facebook or Instagram at Abiding Ministries. I want to see who can come hang out with me. It would be so much fun. All right, so this week I am so excited to have Rachel Ervin. And I love the way this interview came about. I don't want to give it all away because we talk about it at the beginning of the episode, but basically she lives near one of our previous guests from the podcast. And since listening to the episode, she connected to her and they have actually ended up being friends. And it's so much fun. But Rachel ended up emailing me, letting me know about this new friendship, and then shared that she actually had a story to tell herself. And man, it has been amazing to hear about the journey that she's been on probably the last 10 years or so. And it's really exciting to see where God is leading them and how he got them there. So I can't wait for you guys to hear this. So let's go ahead and get started with my conversation with Rachel. Well, hey, Rachel, and welcome to Feathers today.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks.
I'm so glad to have you here. How about we start off and you can introduce yourself, your family, and what keeps you busy these days?
Okay, my name is Rachel, and I am married to my husband, Michael, who I had a crush on when I was in junior high, and I'm not even sure he knew who I was. But God graciously has brought us together. We have 3 small children. Aaliyah is age 6. Gideon is 3.5. He'll turn 4 this summer. And Evangeline Grace, who we call Evie Grace, is turning 1 on Sunday. So that's what keeps me busy right now, for the most part, is just being a mom and keeping up with all the things that they need to do. Aaliyah, my oldest, is in kindergarten, finishing up kindergarten. So we're just a lot of fun things, end of the year things right now. So, but that's basically what keeps me busy at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, I just love those names. How beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Are those did you guys come up with them? Are they family names?
No, we actually came up with them and we love them because of their meaning. We chose names for our children based on their meaning. Aaliyah is basically the feminine version of Elijah. We spell it Eliyah, and it means Yahweh is my God. And then
love
Gideon.
That.
Yeah. And then Gideon's name means warrior, obviously Gideon in the Bible, but we loved it because he was kind of a cowardly warrior, and really it just exemplifies that God is our warrior for us. And then Evangeline means bearer of good news. And so we just love that, pray that she will be one who shares the gospel of Jesus with her life. So
that's just beautiful. Yeah. And I just have to go back to the point where you said you've been with your husband since junior high. Did you literally start dating
Okay, no. I had a crush on him in junior high. He was 5 years older than me. He was a senior in high school, and so I thought he was the heartthrob of the youth group, So it's interesting. My youth pastor's wife at the time was like, well, if you want to marry him, you should start praying that you would. And so I started praying that I would, and then somehow God miraculously answered that and brought us together. I never really it was one of those prayers where it's kind of like far-fetched. You never really thought it was going to happen.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so
I
was highly involved in my youth group, and so I'm getting a little giddy because I'm like trying to imagine myself as like a 7th grader, like in love with a 12th grader. Oh my goodness. So how long did it take before you guys actually started dating?
Well, he went away to college, and I'm just here doing the high school thing. So I think we didn't actually start dating until right after my senior year of high school. But as he would come back from college in the summers, and then I was getting older, like junior in high school, senior in high school, our friend group just kind of started to mesh together because it was like kids that had recently graduated. I was just getting closer to that college age. So our friend group started coming together, and we started hanging out more. But we didn't actually start dating until I was heading off to college, and he was going into his senior year of college. So.
Oh my goodness. And where did you go to college?
I went to Appalachian Bible College for a few years. It's a small Bible college in West Virginia. He went to Moody Bible Institute. So which is in Chicago. So we were long distance for a while. So, yeah.
Oh my goodness. So all of these years together, apart, and then you guys got together.
Yeah,
That's
was
so much fun.
Kind of crazy. And then as we talked, it was just interesting. As we really got to know each other, we grew up about 2 miles down the same road, basically, but our houses were about 2 miles apart, and we went to the same schools, but with him being so much older, we always passed each other. He was always gone before I got there, and just so interesting how God ended up leaving us together, and our paths had crossed so many times when we were younger, and we just didn't know.
So what's his story? So, okay, now I'm really interested, and we're really going down this path. So what was his, does he know, as a senior, that this 7th grader likes him? What does he say now? He was clueless.
Yeah, he was clueless. He was clueless, and actually our mutual youth pastor was like a spiritual father almost to both of us. I mentioned to him one time, what do you think about Rachel? And he's like, I think she's a cool girl. And he said he actually thought one time, oh, she's going to make somebody a really good wife one day. And he never, it never crossed his brain that it would be him. He just didn't think about it. So, yeah, it's an interesting story. Whenever I go back and think through that story, it kind of makes me a little giddy too, because it's man, that was an exciting time. And just to watch God bring that all together was very cool. So
even as a junior high, you had good instincts about the guy.
I guess so. I don't know.
That's great. Okay, so I did want to talk too about how we actually connected. So I had Renee Law on. Oh my goodness, I think it was last season, maybe. I lose track. So. It was earlier this year. Maybe
it's been a while.
Has it?
It's been a while. Yeah.
It goes by so fast. I can't believe we're in season 6 right now. So, oh my goodness. So Renee Law, she is in West Virginia and runs Rebuild, which helps people downtown. And so, tell everybody how you're connected to her now.
Okay, so I was listening to your podcast, and you introduced Renee Law from Huntington, West Virginia, and my ears perked up because West Virginia is very small. And while we don't live in Huntington, we live probably 45 minutes or so from there, and I'm very familiar with Huntington, and so I was just kind of shocked. So I listened to the whole podcast, and then I think I even told my mom, hey, you need to go listen to this. And then we just connected with Renee through Facebook, and we've since been down to Rebuild a few times to help her. She has hosted a couple IF gatherings there. So we've helped her with decorations and food, just setting up for those kinds of things. And just, she's been a good resource for us too, in that I actually went to IF gathering this year, 2017. So, I kind of picked her brain because I knew she had been before, and I hadn't actually been to Austin for it. So I picked her brain about how do I find somebody to room with, and what should I, just those different things that she would know because she had been. Mm-hmm. So that relationship has been really encouraging, and hopefully it's been encouraging for her too. Hopefully it's been mutual.
Oh my gosh, that's so much fun. I love you guys are friends because of the podcast. That makes me so happy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot of fun. Okay, so you reached out and you actually have a story to share, and that's so much fun. So you and your husband have just recently started your own discipleship ministry, and that's really a journey that God has had you on. So I would love if you would take some time tonight to talk about kind of the journey that God has had with you. Take us back to where this kind of all evolved from.
Okay. It's a long story, and I'm just going to try to hit some highlights and kind of bring you up to speed because it's a lot, and I feel like there's a lot of heaviness to it. And so just for everybody who's listening, I just pray that even in the heaviness, the dark things that we walked through in this season, I just pray that they somehow minister grace as well. So my husband, I mentioned he went to Moody Bible Institute. He has a degree in historical theology, and he has a heart to be a pastor.
I'm sorry, interrupt you one time. What is historical theology? When I read that, I was like, what is that?
Basically, it's a fancy way of saying the history of the church. So he loves church history, and that's basically what his degree is in. So if you have a question about church history, he could tell you anything about it, which is funny.
The If gathering, like If did the whole study of the church. So did you see that?
I did see that. I didn't actually do that one.
I didn't. Well, I checked in on it every so often, but I didn't like hardcore do it.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting. He's such a history buff, and I am not. So there are times when I ask him a question, and I kind of want, like the one answer, and he gives me like the 15-minute answer because all the details are important to him. And so it's good for me to hear all those things. But he absolutely loves that. He's very passionate about church history and knowing where we came from and being rooted in that, because otherwise we can kind of sometimes feel like we're the only ones ever who had these same beliefs or who had these same problems. But if you look back through history, you see that, people had similar struggles, and people, they still held to the same truths of the gospel that we love now. This isn't new. So, it's really good for just kind of grounding you.
To do that.
Yeah. It's good for just kind of grounding you in the faith and knowing like you didn't, just come from nothing. There are people before you who paved the way. So,
okay. Awesome.
Sorry. So yes,
keep going.
That's okay. No, that's okay. So I was just going to say he had to be a pastor. We had been married for almost 2 years, and we spent 6 months in Uganda, Africa, just at New Hope Institute of Child Care and Family, which is a title, and it's with a ministry called New Hope Uganda. And basically it's like a 20-week intense discipleship course is basically how I would put it, because it's very difficult to explain everything you go through in 20 weeks of training. But while we were there, God really impressed the American church upon our heart, and the church in Appalachia in general, which is the region of the United States that we're from. And so we came back to the States, came back to West Virginia, and got plugged in at a church. And they had a vision for planting in this region, and so did we. So that's really kind of how we felt God leading us to stay there, was that we had a similar vision. And that was about 6.5 years ago, coming up on 7 years, that we became members there. And during that time, about 2.5 years ago, I'd say, the leaders there approached my husband about basically being the first one to be sent out, being a church planter from there. And they decided to bring him on for 18 months and hopefully send him from there. Sometime during that 18-month period, we would be sent. There were a couple of options, a couple of cities that we were looking at in this area. And basically what happened at the end of that 18 months, we decided that they weren't going to send us to church plant. And there's a lot that goes into that decision. They gave us a very difficult to hear critique, and basically told my husband not to pursue being a pastor at all. So with that kind of begins our journey to where we are now. We took that critique and we took a few days. We actually drove out of town and went and stayed with my aunt and uncle, and they babysat our children. And we just took some time away to really pray through those things to see if that was really God's voice or if that was the voice of man's wisdom. And so we came back and we didn't really agree with that critique. And we also sought the counsel of a few friends outside of that context and said, do you see these things in our life? Can you pray through these things for us? Because we really, if we had some major blind spots, we wanted to know. And they came back and said, we don't see those things. So that's when a lot of the turmoil that we went through started. And let's see. So we were in this place where he was no longer on staff at this church. So he lost his job there, because they didn't want to send him anymore. So he didn't have any income anymore. He had a part-time job on the side. So, he's kind of scrambling to find another job. And then, that was kind of this weird in-between time for us. Like we're still trying to figure out what we should do, and we're still attending this church, but there's a lot of hurt happening at the same time. But it was almost like we couldn't see the forest for the trees. Like we couldn't, because we were in it all the time, we couldn't really see how we were being hurt. And now that we're out of it, looking back, it's so clear the things that were happening. So, they had obviously said, don't pursue pastoral ministry. And, we just didn't feel like that was the way God was leading us. So we were just praying that God would provide an opportunity for whatever he wanted. And if that was to stay there in that church and my husband work a secular job for the rest of his life, we would have been completely content with that if that's what God had. So fast forward a little bit to June 2016, and my sister got married at a bed and breakfast about 60 miles north of where we are. And we were there. My husband officiated the wedding. It was a wonderful weekend. And while we were there, we were out sitting on the porch of this bed and breakfast the night before the wedding. And there was a gentleman walking down the street with his grandson. And my mom just happened to run into them. And she noticed that his grandson was about the same age as my Gideon. And so she said, why don't you go find Gideon? He's over there playing. You guys could play. So he did. He comes running up on the porch and it's like, has anybody seen Gideon? And I don't recognize this little boy at all. I've never seen him. So it was kind of odd. But, I said, yeah, sure. He's over there. So he went over and played. And the next thing I know, Michael is talking to his grandfather. And if anybody knows my husband at all, he's extremely personable and can't go anywhere without him knowing someone. I mean, almost every time we're out of the house, he knows somebody. So I kind of thought, well, maybe he just knows him. I mean, we're 60 miles from home, but I don't know. So later he told me that this gentleman was a pastor of a small church that had been planted there in that small town. This is a very rural town in Appalachia. It had been planted there about 10 or 11 years ago. And as they continued to talk, he was looking for someone to come on kind of part-time as a discipleship pastor. And that's Michael's heart, really. He loves to teach and he loves to preach, but his love is for people and for mentoring them, discipling them, and just living life, like walking through the hard things of life beside them. And he's very good at that. He's very gifted at that. So they decided to grab lunch weeks later. And as they did, this pastor's name was Ervin. And as Michael and Ervin talked, it was like the questions that Michael and I had already discussed, the things that we kind of wanted to know and needed answered. Ervin was bringing them up without Michael having to ask. And he asked us to pray about it and see how we felt about Michael coming up and preaching and just visiting the church, kind of getting a feel for it. And so we did that in I think it was the beginning of July of 2016. We went up and Michael preached at that church, and we went to lunch with Ervin and his family afterward, and they said, take 2 weeks and pray about it. And we got in the car and I was just like, we don't need 2 weeks. We don't need 2 weeks. He was answering our questions before we even asked them. Our hearts seemed to be geared in the same direction. And so we did take 2 weeks, though, even though we really didn't feel like we needed it. We did take that 2 weeks, and we really prayed and just asked if that was the direction God was leading us. And we knew that leaving our church and telling the leadership that we were going to take a pastoral position, we knew that would not go well for us. The months previous to that had been extremely difficult and stressful.
So this whole time you've been at the church that told you shouldn't be pastor. So how many years was that from the time they told you you shouldn't be a pastor to this?
6. Oh, that was only a few months. That was February of 2016. So it was just a few months, but those few months were very tumultuous. There was a lot of like back and forth with them, them wanting to have meetings, and it was, I hesitate sometimes to even use these words, but it was abusive, spiritually abusive. And if anybody has any questions about that, there's a book called The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse. And then Mary DeMuth also has a blog post called The 10 Ways to Spot Spiritual Abuse. And it's taken me a long time to be comfortable calling it that, because honestly, that's harsh. But that is what happened to us. And as we've come out of it, we have connected with other people who left that church before us, and we've seen similarities in our story and theirs. And so because it seems to be that we weren't the only ones, that it's kind of a systemic thing, a reoccurring thing, it could be defined as that. So my husband was also a podcast called the Known and Loved podcast with Mike and Susan Adams. He wasn't actually on it. He had been in contact with them, and kind of walking through our situation with them. And he wrote out our story, and they interacted with that on their podcast. It's episode number 56, which you can put in the show notes if anybody's interested in hearing a little bit more in depth of some of the things that we walk through, with church leadership. So yes, so that was just a few months period. But when we got to the point where we knew we were supposed to go to this other church, we knew that it wasn't going to be an easy exit from the church where we were. Honestly, we were almost fearful to like tell them what we were doing. We weren't almost fearful. We were. And we just didn't want to. We didn't really want to have to do we knew was coming. And we had seen, my husband had been an elder at that church for like 4 years at this point, 4 years at this point. And so he had watched other people leave, and he never really had the whole story, but he watched a lot of other people leave, and it was just hard. It was not good. And so now we were kind of on the other side. He wasn't on the leadership team anymore. He was on the other side leaving, and he just kind of knew what was coming. So we really wrestled through it and prayed about it. And one of the ways God really confirmed that for us was Michael's secular job is in health insurance. So he answers the phone and talks to people who need help with their health, or to have questions about it, that kind of thing. And so one day some woman calls in, which is not out of the ordinary at all, but she got finished with whatever she needed for her health insurance. And then, Michael had just been praying that morning, like, God, would you just show me if this is what we're supposed to do? Because I just need to know that this is from you. And so this lady, before she hung up, she said, I don't know who you are. I don't know anything about you. But I'm feeling really impressed, really led to tell you that whatever is in front of you, you're supposed to pursue it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so he was like, excuse me? That was not what he was expecting her to say at all. And she said, I don't know. Like, I just felt that I was led to tell you that. And Michael was like, okay, thanks, and we don't even that woman was a believer. We kind of assumed that she was, but God can use any means. So that was one way that God showed us. And then the night that we were supposed to have a meeting with the leadership, we were both kind of like, oh, I want to do this. And I typically on Mondays, I would Michael would come home from work and I'd be ready to go, and I would go to the gym for like 30 or 40 minutes, and then I'd come home and spend the rest of the evening with my family. So that was kind of our routine. I liked to be ready when he got there because I wanted to get there and get it done and get home to be with my kids and him. And this particular evening, we were supposed to have that meeting later, so I was kind of even in more of a hurry. And he got home, and I wasn't ready to go. And he was like, "It's okay, just take your time and get ready." And I was just so frustrated, like, oh. So I ended up being about 15 minutes late. And the minute I pulled into the parking lot, I knew why I was late. God wanted me to run into someone, and who I would have never seen had I been there 15 minutes earlier like I normally was. There was a gentleman in the parking lot who we knew from growing up. Michael grew up with him. We had been in ministry with him. He had actually been a part of this same church and had been hurt by that church and left. He actually moved out of state, and then he had moved back to West Virginia. So we hadn't seen him since he had moved back, and I just happened to run into him on that night, which I don't think is chance. And he was like, "Hey, how are you?" And when he asked how I was, I mean, I was doing awful. So I don't even remember how I responded to him. I think I was kind of honest, but I didn't go into details. And then he just said, "Can I pray with you?" And he prayed, and it was just like all fear was gone. All fear of talking to them was gone. And it was just like, you know what? That's what God wants. And that was just kind of another push. Like, there are people out here who love you and who are praying for you and who you haven't talked to in 3 years. And you just happened to run into them. So just God just kept encouraging us with like those little interactions along the way. So we had the meeting, and we told them that we were leaving to go do pastoral ministry somewhere else on a part-time basis. And I kind of like to say that's when the wheels really fell off. Just a lot happened in between those times. They emailed my husband's new boss and tried to just said some defaming things. And thankfully, they had been very honest about where we were coming from with this new pastor and this new church. We had been very honest about where we were coming from. So they weren't really surprised to get that email because the leadership had been kind of controlling along the way. But one of the things that encouraged me was God continued to give me Exodus 14:14. And this is important because we'll circle back around to it. It comes completely full circle. And he would just impress that verse onto my heart. And it says, "The Lord will fight for you. You have only to be silent." And so as much as like we wanted to defend ourselves in these situations, we didn't. And we didn't have to. God continually showed over and over again how he was doing that. One instance, there were a couple of families that came to us that said, "Hey, I don't know what's going on, but one of the pastors came to me and said, 'Do you want to know my side of the story of why this family left?'" And we didn't know that was happening. But in this instance, there were 3 different families that came to us, and all 3 of them said, "No, they left because God called them to, and we don't need to know if there's another side of it, and we don't want to take sides. It's not about taking sides." And so that was just little ways like that God was showing that we didn't have to defend ourselves, that he was doing it for us in the hearts of our friends and other people. So we did go to this church, and we were driving an hour every Sunday, which was pretty hard with 3 little kids at this point, because Evie was born in May. So, and we started really feeling like, is this really what God's calling us to do? Like, he obviously called us to this place, but I don't know long term. And so we just really started praying through that. And then in December of this past year, right before Christmas, my son got really sick. He was in the hospital for almost a week. He had some swelling and pain in his knees to the point that he almost couldn't walk. They couldn't figure out what was going on. So we were in the hospital for a week, and they gave us a diagnosis that was not like we weren't comfortable with, and neither was our pediatrician. So she gave us a referral to Cincinnati Children's because that's the closest children's hospital for us. So, or one of the closest. So my son was in the hospital for a week. He got out on like a Thursday evening, I think. And Monday morning we got the call that my mother-in-law had passed away unexpectedly. So it just seemed like a lot of dark things were hitting us all at once. It was just very interesting though with my mother-in-law's passing. My father-in-law had passed away actually before we were ever married. So she was my husband's only parent left. And we grieved. It was hard. But in it, there was so much hope. And I sometimes hesitate to say that because I don't want to sound heartless. Like we didn't care. We did. It was horrible. And it still is. And, you know, that's something we continue to deal with every day and try to process through all of that. But I just remember this was the week before Christmas. I think she died on the 19th. And so I think that was the day, 19th or 20th. And I just remember sitting with Michael on the couch in front of the Christmas tree and thinking like, this is not how Christmas is supposed to be. But yet this is exactly why Jesus came. Like, because there was so much hope. Like the advent of Emmanuel this past Christmas never seemed more real. Never felt so real because we were in desperate need of the hope that was to come when Jesus came to earth. And, I just remember both of us, I mean, he even said like, I've never been so sad and so hopeful at the same time. And, but with that, we even started to question even more, like, should we be going to this church an hour away and be pouring out in ministry every week when, number one, we've been hurt by the church and we haven't had time to heal. Number two, we're dealing with a child and we're dealing with the loss of a parent. Like it was so much. And so in January, my son, we did go to Cincinnati. He was diagnosed with juvenile arthritis. And,
oh my goodness, I didn't know that was a thing.
Yes, it's like an autoimmune. Okay, this is a new diagnosis, so I haven't done a ton of reading on it. But we did steroid injections in his knees, and he's been fine. The steroids are supposed to last for 6 months, so I think he had his injections late January, so we're kind of coming up on the 6 month mark fairly soon. We'll kind of see where we go from there. But autoimmune disease, and so it's just genetic. It was in his genes. And with that, the passing of my mother-in-law, we decided we needed to step away from this church ministry for a time, and maybe forever, but definitely for a time of healing and just giving us time to grieve and giving us time to rest as a family. And that seemed odd. It seemed really weird. Like, God, you called us to this. Like, there was that phone call with that lady, and there was just all these other things that happened around that same time where God answered huge prayers and showed us specifically, like, this is where you're supposed to go. And so it didn't make any sense. And then I went to IF Gathering in February of this year. And Ellie Holcomb sang some of her songs, and one of the songs was Red Sea Road from her new album, yep. Red Sea Road. Okay. So before she sang it, she gave like this little sermonette, and she started it out with Exodus 14:14. And so here's where it comes full circle. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be silent. And she said, do you know what happens after that? And in all the months that God had led me to that verse, he had never led me to read any further. Like, I don't know why I didn't. Like, looking back, I'm like, why would I not read the whole passage? Why would I just read one verse? I don't know, but God ordained it all. And so like that just completely piqued me. Like, I was hooked. I'm sitting there in the audience, like, what's she going to say next? So after God told the Israelites to just be silent, that he was going to fight for them, he parted the Red Sea and he made a way for them from the people who were pursuing them and trying to harm them. And I think I cried all the way through the song when she sang, because I felt like it was like she had an insight to what we had been walking through. And And that's when we kind of realized that this other church position that we took, because God led us there, and then he led us shortly after to say this, we can't continue in this, realized that was kind of our Red Sea road. That was our way out of a situation that was emotionally and spiritually harmful for us. And it was like we didn't even know in the midst of it. We didn't even know that it was harming us. And God used this other thing as a way out and as a way to, to get us from point A to point B.
Well, because if you had thought about it like that, you would have felt manipulative.
Exactly.
Like, we'll just do this, and then in like 6 months we'll just quit it, and that'll be our way out. You would never do that. No, that was never our intention. It was never our thought. But God, I don't know. God is so much. He just knows. He knows. So we told the church, so I came home from If Gathering, and I'm telling my husband, I'm like, this is it. Like, this is our Red Sea road. This is, I'm all excited and all pumped up. And he agreed with me. Like, he really did feel like that was just a way for us to get out of a harmful situation. So we told them, we need a break, and this might be a really long break, and it might be a forever break, but we don't know. We're just really following what God has, and we know that we need rest. So we stepped down from that. And the whole time, after my mother-in-law died, everyone asked us, going to live in the house? This was the big question, because the house that she lived in was the house that my husband's grandfather had built. And it's been in the family, obviously, for 2 generations. And I'll be completely honest, we didn't want to live in this house. We didn't want to live in the town where the house was. We were happy where we were. We were living in Charleston, the capital city. So we were living there, in a downtown. Charleston's not a huge city, so living downtown is not near as cool as living in downtown, say, Chicago or New York. It's small. But so we were living there. It was really close to my husband's office, and he biked to work and this and that. So we really loved kind of where we were, and we had always kind of said we didn't want to live in this little town. So the whole family is just like, will you guys please consider living there? My husband has 2 sisters, but neither of which are in a position to live in this house. It's a fairly large house. It's 5 bedrooms and 4.5 bathrooms. It's way bigger than anything we have ever lived in and ever envisioned ourselves living in. It was just nothing we ever wanted. Nothing we ever wanted. And so we were like, no, we're not moving in there. I don't know what we're going to do at the house, but we're not moving in there. But God, he just started in our hearts, how could we use this house? How could we use this house for God's glory? Because for 2 generations, the house has been full of darkness, really, and addiction, alcoholism. And that was part of the reason we didn't want to move in here. I was like, that place is dark, and we don't really want to be in that. And our family kept saying, yeah, but you guys could bring so much light. You could bring the light of Jesus to that house. And it's interesting, my husband's family, for 2 generations, none of them would have considered themselves believers. And then his generation, all of his cousins are believers. One of them, they're a missionary family, and the other ones are just super amazing believers. God has redeemed an entire generation, and it's amazing. So, they're all just yeah, but God wants to use you guys. You guys could do something great with this house. So we just really started praying through it, and we decided, okay, this is what we're supposed to do. So, that's when we started dreaming about what does it look like to use this house, to use this space for something other than our own enjoyment and the American dream kind of thing. What does it look like to use this house to love us, to serve others, to live out Jesus to the people that are around us in our neighborhood and whoever else we meet. And another little interesting thing, when my husband's grandfather passed away, we were not even engaged. We were dating, I think, at the time. And one of his cousins asked me to walk through this house and pray with her. And so I did. We prayed, we anointed and prayed. And that was new for me. I had never done anything like that.
And I was like 19 at the time. And so it was kind of like, oh, this is kind of interesting. But it was a really powerful experience. And then, when we decided to move into this house, she actually came to me and she said, I didn't want to tell you this before you made your decision because I didn't want to sway you. But do you remember 9 years ago when Grandpa died and we prayed through this house together? And I was like, yeah, I'll never forget that. That was powerful for me. And she said, well, when we were praying, I had this vision of you and Michael and a family living here.
Oh my
and I was like,
goodness.
are you really? Like, really? Because we were not even engaged. Like, we were just still dating. I mean, we were very seriously dating. I think we got engaged a few months later. But, so that was just like, okay, that's just another confirmation that this is what we're supposed to do. It doesn't make sense. It's nothing we've ever wanted, but this is how God's leading us. And there's just like confirmation after
Isn't it
confirmation.
funny? You're like, oh man, God, like, like I can't ignore that.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like so obvious. You can't ignore it. That's
so
funny.
one of the things that we had talked about, like, I think I said my husband loves discipleship and loves mentorship and like teaching. He loves teaching, but he kind of prefers like teaching to smaller groups, more like interactive teaching, I guess, rather than like standing on the stage in front of a bunch of people lecturing. Although he does well when he has to do that, but that's not a sweet spot. So he had already kind of talked about like, what would it ever be like? And this was a year or so ago before even this house was ever a thought. What would it be like to have like a discipleship ministry where we just, pour into people and we host Bible studies in our homes and, not like a counseling ministry because he's not a counselor, but like just somebody to kind of walk with you, whether you need an accountability partner or you want like kind of premarital counseling. We've done some premarital counseling. He's officiated weddings. And so we've done premarital counseling and, just things like that. Just basically living life with people and loving them. And, so with this house, we were like, okay, so how are we going to get this out? How are we going to use this space? And one of the biggest things is, my mother-in-law added on to this house when she moved in 9 years ago. She added on a master suite, which is, very large and has a private back porch off of it, its own private entrance. It also has a very large bathroom with like a whirlpool tub. And, it's in a very quiet neighborhood. We're right on the river. So our property overlooks the river. We're like the only house in the neighborhood with a double lot. So we've got this big backyard. She loved birds. My mother-in-law loved birds. And so there's tons of birds because she always fed the birds. So she's got tons of bird feeders and, it's very serene in the backyard. It just kind of feels like you're in the middle of nowhere, but you're really not. You're just a couple miles from town. So there are 4 other bedrooms in the upstairs of the house that were original to the house. And so we just took the original master bedroom as ours. And, we want to open up this master suite. We're still kind of in the renovation process, but one of our dreams is to open up this master suite for people to come who need rest, who need somebody to pray with, or maybe they just want to pray by themselves, or maybe their family has walked through something hard and they just want to take a couple days away, to just be together. There's not a whole lot to do like in the immediate vicinity. We have bicycles, and it's a very nice neighborhood for biking or running or walking. We hope to develop the riverbank area a little bit more and have, like some benches down there where you could journal or pray, and that kind of thing. We are looking at getting kayaks since we're on the river and having that as an option for people to do if that's something they want to do, but really just want to provide a safe place for people to come who need rest. And with that, a discipleship ministry as well. So like, probably it's going to start out looking like, a couple in-home Bible studies. And then my husband also has some men that he meets with on a regular basis anyway, to disciple and mentor. And so just kind of bringing that like into our home. We just want to use this house to love other people, and to move into our neighborhood. Which is interesting. Are you familiar with Shannon Martin? Have you read her book, Falling Free?
I have not read that yet. I interviewed
Okay.
her last year before it came out, and then I haven't. I bought it, but I haven't picked it up yet. I mean, I haven't picked it up to read it yet.
Okay. So I was reading that book in the midst of trying to decide if we're supposed to live in this house. And like, she basically went from living, they moved into like a more impoverished neighborhood and smaller home and all these things that seemed very like radical. And it was such a challenge to me as I'm thinking through. I'm like, God, why? That's where we lived already. We lived in a small house in an impoverished neighborhood, like that didn't, and that's what we loved that. And so it didn't make sense. Like, why would we go into this and this over here that just basically looks like the American dream because it's in like the nicest neighborhood in town? And I don't know, it didn't feel right. And then God just impressed on my heart, like, the people in their comfort, those neighbors there that are in their comfort and in their prosperity, they need me as much as the people who are in poverty. And I'm calling you to go there. And so it's like, okay. Again, it was never what we had envisioned, but we also have vision for like just having, our neighbors into our home. Our kids have been so sweet and like already loving on our neighbors. There's a couple. Most of our neighbors are elderly and have like lived in these homes their entire life. There aren't really very many children on our street. We've mowed grass for the lady across the street whose husband passed away. We've mowed her grass, and my kids have like written notes and delivered them to some of the other neighbors. And, it's just fun to watch even your kids loving on the people that are around them, even though they don't really know them yet. And they don't even necessarily know that that's our vision as a family. I think they've just kind of caught on to loving people. And so that's really fun. But that's kind of where we are now. That's where we are now. We just want to provide a soft place for people to land that need that, because we walked through a season where we felt like if we could just get away and pray and have some time to regroup and refresh from all the hard things that we had walked through. And we really didn't have that. We didn't have a place like that. And financially, we weren't in a place where we could just, throw down a few $100s on a hotel room for the weekend. And honestly, a hotel room is really not very conducive to a family of 5. So
tell me about
any kind of real rest.
There's something, and just a side note, since we've become a family of 5 instead of 4, hotel rooms are so hard. Everything is built for a family of 4. Yeah. That's a little rant. Sorry.
Yeah. So that's just what we want to provide. And we don't really know exactly what that looks like going forward. It's just been one step at a time. So we had an estate sale, and then we did some renovations to the main part of the house that we were going to live in. And then we moved in. So that was kind of the first step, like, get here. So we moved in. We've been here a little over a month, and it's still kind of chaotic. But we have done a little bit of renovate. We had the master suite. We had it painted. We've had it repainted, and we have someone coming next week to look at new flooring for it. Just because my mother-in-law had carpet and she had a cat, and my husband has asthma. My husband has asthma. We can't live in a place that has, cat dander in the carpet. So we've pulled up the carpet, and we're just kind of waiting on new flooring to come. And we actually just this week got our paperwork from the state of West Virginia that we are officially, it's our certificate of incorporation.
And tell us the name of the company.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's called the Sparrow Company. And
why is that?
Okay. Well, it isn't just because we love birds. Because we don't really.
That is a nice tie-in.
Yeah, right, with the feathers.
I was just thinking to your mother-in-law loving birds.
Yes. Yeah. She did love birds. I don't really. But that's okay. Birds to me, like, whenever I think of birds, they're a picture of freedom for me. And I know they're used in other, in poetry and scripture and things like that as a symbol of freedom. And that's what we want to do with our life. We, since the very first If Gathering, I hosted an If Local, the very first If Gathering, and God started a freedom journey for me and a few other ladies, 3 in particular, other ladies, at that first If Gathering. and he has knit our hearts together. And even though one of them moved out of state, we are still very connected and very much spurring each other on toward this freedom in Christ and knowing who you are in Jesus and not being maybe tied to what everybody else thinks you should be or what you think you should be or, what's acceptable in your church circle, whatever it is, but just being free in who Jesus made you and using the gifts that he has given you and flourishing in that. So myself have been on this freedom journey for the last 4 years or so. And so birds represent freedom. And sparrows in particular, they're mentioned in scripture as like God cares even for the sparrows who are like just plain ordinary birds. And like, isn't that how we all view ourselves? I don't think any of us look at ourselves like, oh, I'm just this super Christian and I'm amazing. I think we all look at ourselves in our lives as very ordinary and very mundane, yet God cares for us. And with sparrows also there's, a companionship. They usually are like together. You rarely see like one. I think they kind of travel together. And so kind of our tagline is living together in the freedom of Christ. And that's what we want to do. We want to walk with other people and we want to spur each other on as we walk this journey together toward freedom, the freedom that, Christ bought for us on the cross. And that's kind of the whole thrust behind it. So we don't necessarily know what all the details look like as far as like, okay, are we going to have this Bible study or we're going to do X, Y, and Z? We don't really have all that planned out and mapped out, but we know that the thrust behind it is just living together in freedom with Jesus, and one another, because that's what we're called to in scripture is to, spur one another on, encourage one another, build one another up and push each other to Jesus. So that's kind of where the Sparrow Company came from. And it was something that it just kind of popped into my mind one day, and I brought it up to Michael, and he was like, I like that. And so we really did just kind of pray about it for a little while. We just kind of sat on it, like, is this really what we should do? And since then, God's just solidified that that's what we do. That's the name that he gave us for it. So yeah.
Well, oh my goodness. So I have just so enjoyed listening to your, your, not just a story, it's your life, but you did such a great job sharing that. And I've just been doing, I don't know, a happy jig over here. I mean, it's just so awesome to see God move all of those parts together, and the times when you have no idea what's going on and you're just like going in obedience and then just looking back and seeing how God works those pieces together. It just excites me so much. And, gosh, it's so exciting to see where, we're kind of in the, the ground floor, I guess you could say, of
definitely
this ministry.
Definitely the ground.
Yeah, but it's so exciting. I mean, I think part of the thing, you're going to have so many more stories to share in the future, and we'll have to have you back on the podcast when you can share some of those. But it's really exciting to see how God has moved you guys into this space where it feels like it's a good, ground resting place,
Yes.
for your family. And it can be, it could be short term. We don't know. You never know what God's going to do, but it seems like it's going to be kind of a long-term thing for you guys. That's so exciting. So I just thinking back to questions, and as you guys ponder all this, I'm just curious about that 6-year wait, that you guys had. Can you yet look back and kind of see how God used those 6 years to prepare you for this?
Oh my goodness. Yes. Yes. I felt like we were in a waiting season forever. And, God just kept, and it was hard. It was hard. I don't want to by any means make it seem like, oh, it's just a piece of cake. And I was just happy and content the whole time. I was not. And neither was Michael. And we just kept praying like, God, what are you doing? Why are we sitting here waiting? And he, it was a challenge for us to live in the waiting. not to just survive in the waiting, like to really live and develop our gifts and seek to know Jesus more and to love the people we were around in the waiting. And I think, I don't know. I think sometimes we get this idea that one day we're just going to arrive and it's going to be this big thing. And it's never been that way for us. And even with this doesn't feel like some big thing. It feels like the next little step. And so I think even in that 6-year waiting period, it was kind of like just trusting God for the next little step and whatever that was. And it's interesting that you said this might not be long term, and it might be long term and it might not be. During our marriage, so my husband and I have been married for almost 9 years. And in that time, we have lived in 8 different places. So we moved a lot. And so we did a lot of moving during those 6 years. We lived in like 3 or 4 different places. All the while just, trusting God for the next step. It was just interesting too. Even those places, like we actually moved into a family's, our cousin's home, and knowing that we had one in that house before they came back from the mission field to be there. That was a step of faith, and like, okay, God, you're calling us to this house for 1 year, and we don't know where we're going to go after that. But you'll provide. And he did. And he does. But even like moving here to this house, knowing that it probably is long term, was almost scary, because I'm used to moving like every 1.5 years or 2 years, and not, actually putting down roots feels kind of weird after a season of where we didn't really put down any roots. We tried to live wherever but we knew nothing was long term. And so moving into a long term place, there's even some fear that goes along with that. Like, am I going to be okay with this? Or in 2 years, am I going to be getting that itch to like do something different? Because that's what we've always done. But yeah, that 6-year waiting period, it was difficult. But God did. He has shaped us. And I think he's allowed us, to see that we both really have a heart for discipleship and for, even using our stories and the hard parts of our stories and how God is bringing healing and freedom to be a catalyst for other people and their healing and their freedom. And we're not perfect, and we won't be, and we're still going to have scars, and we're still going to have, areas where we slip up. But I think that 6 years, God did. He taught us a lot about who he is, and even just the lack of discipleship within the American church, at least where we are.
I was just going to ask about that. I actually have it written in, this is what I have written in my notebook as you were talking. Is in regards to discipleship, what are we missing in the American church?
Oh man.
I think we're, I don't feel like, and I'm including myself in that, because I think I'm kind of really terrible at this. And so I really want to know, like, if I want to disciple somebody, what in the world do I do?
I don't think I'm the expert on this at all. But I mentioned earlier that we had spent some time in Uganda. While we were there, we were actually with the ministry that Michael's cousin and his family are with. And while we were there, they were our mentors, and they still are. We actually they had been home for about 6 months. They were here, during the time that my mother-in-law passed away, and that was such a gift, but we just sent them off earlier this week to head back to Uganda. So that has been, hard, to see them go again for another couple years. But, they just walked through life with us, and they walked through hard things with us, and we were open and vulnerable, and they were open and vulnerable, and it was a mutually encouraging and holding each other accountable and all those kinds of things. So we had that when we were in Uganda. We were, I think we had our 2nd anniversary while we were there. So we were still really young and newly married. We didn't have kids yet. We came back to America really hoping for relationships like that. And we never got those while we were here. Since we've been here, really, we've both tried, and it was just kind of like nobody really understood maybe what we were looking for, or they had just never had that experience. So they, if you haven't done it, you can't really or if you haven't been the beneficiary of it, you can't really give it to somebody else because you've never experienced it. And, again, if gathering this year, just talking about like just making one disciple, just focusing on the small, living and loving people and just walking with them through this life. I have a small group of friends now. Leaving that church we were at for 6 years, we basically lost all of our community, and all of our friends, except for a handful. And actually all of those in that handful of friends, God has moved out of state except for one family. So that's been interesting, but, I wouldn't even call that relationship that I have, that one family that's still here, I wouldn't call that necessarily like I'm discipling her or she's discipling me. It's just a mutually exclusive, like we're just mutually encouraging one another. And, if I'm having a bad day, like I can call her or text her and be like, I'm a mess today because the enemy is tempting me to believe these lies. And then, she'll give me scripture, or she'll send me a song on, like a YouTube video of a song, or, something that's ministered to her, or she'll just say, I'm praying for you. Or, hey, let's go grab Mexican tonight, or whatever, and, I think discipleship, we make it this big thing. I think we make it this big thing that like we have to sit down and have coffee and go through this book, and it has to look like this. And maybe it does look like that, maybe it does. Maybe it looks like that in the season of life that you're in or that someone else is in. For me, with little children, discipleship doesn't look like that for me. Discipleship for me right now is mainly focused on my children and the few people that God would allow me to just be involved with in daily life. But I think a lot of times it's just the small, like remembering to connect with people. We're busy, and we kind of wear that as a badge of honor sometimes, like, oh, I'm busy. When really what we need to be is not so consumed with ourselves and our schedules. And we need to reach out to those that God has put in our path in a more daily way, rather than just seeing each other at church and in passing, hey, how are you? Well, nobody's going to go any deeper than I'm fine, or maybe sharing one little thing in that setting. But if you're in contact with someone on it doesn't have to be you have a phone call every day, but it could, or I think it's just more simple. I think that's what I'm trying to say. It's just more simple than what we're making it out to be. Sometimes,
I love that you brought that back up from If Gathering, because that was I think super impactful this year.
Yes,
it's just getting involved in some in people's lives, and I think so we've just lost that. And I don't know if even that I've been alive that it's been around. I don't know. I don't know.
No, I don't think so. I haven't seen it, and sometimes I wonder if the generations that, above us, above me, if they, even, there have been some older women say things like, well, these young girls, they've kind of got their stuff together. They don't really need anything that I have to offer. And the world is so different now, like technology and social media and everything is so different from what their generation had growing up. But I think sometimes those relationships get neglected, and we tend to hang out with people that just like us. And I'm guilty of that. But I think it's so beneficial to try to get to know people that are different than us, and especially women that are older than us that have walked through life a lot longer. They've been on this earth a lot longer than we have, and they just have more wisdom and more things to give. And their life may have looked a lot different than what our life looks like now. But that doesn't mean that they don't have experiences with Jesus that we need to learn from. Just like, I think everybody at If Gathering this year loved Jill Briscoe.
Oh my gosh, totally in love with her now.
Right? Like everybody loved her. And I think that, that's just an example of a woman who is sharing her life and the things that God taught her. Any woman can do that. That's what I just did with you just now, basically, is walk through a portion of my life and the things that God is teaching me. And, hopefully that's encouraging to other people who are listening and, do that simply, with the people that are around us. It can, and in seasons with little kids, it's hard. I mean, I'll just be honest, it's hard. But I also think that God has just convicted me as far as my children go, that if I'm not pouring into them and discipling them, then I really don't have any business doing that with anyone else, because they are my first calling. They are the disciples that are in my own home.
That's something totally,
so,
even as having this podcast and ministry and stuff, it's like God has talked with me many times. You got to pour into your kids. You got to pour into your kids. I'm just thinking about my daughter. She's going in 9th grade next year. Oh my gosh.
Oh my goodness.
So I really just have a couple more years with her, before she's really, an adult. And, yeah, so that's just such a good reminder. And I love that you brought that up, because, you always go, this is what I do. Like, who could I disciple? And, where am I missing it? I'm like, hello, you've got 3 kids under your roof that, it's not to say I don't think that God doesn't call us to things outside of our home.
Yes.
Because clearly I'm sitting here on a podcast that I feel like God has called me to.
Exactly.
But I think that's so important for moms. There's a lot of moms that listen to this podcast. So I think it's a really good thing for us to remember, is that, first and foremost, our kids are who we disciple. And that's what we do with our kids, right? We're just living with them.
Yes.
And pouring into them as we go.
Yes. And we're living, and we're not, they see everything that they see when we have good days, and they see when we have bad days, and they see when we mess up. Kids probably know our sin more clearly than we do, because they see it and it affects them. And I think when we're living life with other people outside our home, we tend to try to cover up those things. And I think, not that you need to air all your dirty laundry for the world to see, but there are those relationships where you need to be gut level honest about your struggles, because that's why God gave us other people. He gave us relationships for, to help us grow and to encourage us. And we can't grow and we can't be encouraged if we're not being honest about the things that are difficult in our lives. So,
yeah, it's so interesting. I was just listening to a podcast by Annie Downs, and she was talking about a book writing and how there's always these themes. I don't know if you've recognized it too, but I read a lot of the Christian nonfiction that's coming out for this podcast. And I have for a while, even before the podcast. I love Christian nonfiction, but there does always seem to be like a theme of books. It's in, like, sometimes I wonder, like, did they all get together and just try to write books to compete with each other, and every publisher picked one, and just so, but it's so very interesting, the themes, and how she was talking about how she can see a theme of friendship right now, with Never Unfriended and Uninvited, and the one from Encourage. I had Renee Swope on last season. She talked about that book. I don't know why I can't think of the name of it right now. But anyway, just this idea of friendship, and I think that just plays into it. That I think God is reminding us that a lot of the discipleship too is really just being in community with people.
Yes.
Yes. And so definitely, it's interesting that it all comes back to that. So, well, Rachel, we are out of time for this, but I have so enjoyed hearing your story, and it's just been wonderful to hear how God has been working, and we'll just be praying for you guys in your new ministry, and we'll have to send people your way. If people want to know, find more about your ministry and what you guys are doing, how can they connect with you?
Okay, well, we have a website. It is the Sparrow Co, just CO.org. And from there, you can find us. You can find links to our social media, which are kind of bare bones right now. Our Instagram is probably the most active at this point, just because Instagram is kind of my preferred social media outlet. So Instagram, our handle is the_Sparrow_Co. And then, like I said, if you just go to the website, then on the bottom, there's the little icons. You can click for Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. There's also a way to contact us through email if you want to. And one other thing I wanted to mention that's exciting about just what's coming up, what's coming. We're in the process of working with a nonprofit called Bean Cause, Bean Cause, and it's a company that works with nonprofits and to help us. So we're working with them, and they're going to help us raise money by selling coffee. And you would have a subscription. I think they said it's either $15 or $20 a month. You get a coffee subscription, and we get a portion of that every month. So that is soon to come on our website. Like I said, we're working with them, getting them logos and all that stuff so that we can get the website configured. But that's something that we're really excited about. And just another thing that God has led us to, kind of the next little step. We had thought about roasting our own coffee and trying to sell it to help us raise money. And then lo and behold, on Instagram, I somehow stumbled across this company they're just launching. They only have one other nonprofit they're working with at this point. So they're on the ground floor too. And they've been so gracious to work with us. And,
well, that's so cool.
So
everybody
that's another
can
exciting
use some
thing.
coffee.
Yeah. Well, if they're like me, they can use some. So,
yes.
yeah. So like I said, that's still kind of in the works, but, we're hoping to kind of have a little bit of a launch sometime in June, and we'd be able to launch the coffee, subscriptions then. So we'll see how God leads, but that's kind of the next step that we're working toward. So.
All right. Very exciting.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time with me tonight.
Thank you, Amy. It was a pleasure. It was really fun. Thanks.
Well, man, guys, I just love that episode with Rachel. There's a few things I want to take away from that episode. The first is just to highlight that wait of 6 years. That is a long time to wait on God when you feel like you've been called to something. And I know she said that at times she didn't wait very well, but you know what? I think God can handle our impatience, and He is so patient with us and doesn't give in to our demands even when we want Him to. And He's just holding on to that good plan and the good gift He has for us, and He really will work it out for our good. And you notice I didn't say work it out exactly how we have planned, but He works it out for our good. You know, this story isn't to say they wanted to plant a church and they waited on God 6 years and then God did it. No, you know, right now they're living a very different story in ministry than they thought, but God did not waste that time of waiting and is using it for good. So I hope that it encourages you folks that are waiting for God to move. He sees you, He has plans, and He really will work it out if you keep listening for His voice and keep following it. And that's really the second thing, is how they kept following God's voice even when it didn't make any sense. And, you know, they can look back now and see what God was doing. I mean, didn't you just love that Red Sea moment? Gosh, I love how God does that. He was really watching over them and protecting them. And the thing is, they didn't even see it or understand it at the time. They just followed His voice. And it just reminds me so much of our verse here on the podcast. He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you will find refuge. You know, they may have had to endure a couple months, suffering, but God did not leave them alone in that. And gosh, there's so much more about this journey I love, you know, how they're caring for people in their own neighborhood, and all people need to know and understand the love of God for them, and, you know, how good really is coming out of something that is difficult as losing a parent. Man, so much good stuff. I hope you're just as encouraged as I am from that episode with Rachel. So guys, that's it for this week. I want to remind you to reach out to me if you are interested at all in seeing a live event happen. And guys, as always, I'm so thankful to be doing this podcast and meeting you here each week. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next week on Feathers.